Starting the respiratory system, first we're going to go over some anatomy and function, and then we're going to go over physiology in later videos. First off, function, it's the major function is the site of gas exchange, and the gases we're talking about is oxygen, which is going from the lungs into the bloodstream, and then carbon dioxide, which is going from the bloodstream to the lungs to be expired. So we're going to talk about different types of respiration. There's going to be external and internal, and how air gets into the lungs by different pressure changes. So that's going to be movement of air. You have to get the air in. So you bring oxygen down into the lungs where it's in contact with the bloodstream, and you get rid of carbon dioxide. Filtering, warming, and humidifying the air. This is mainly the upper respiratory. So this is going to be your nose, your nasal cavity, mouth if you're mouth breathing, but mainly it's going to be nasal cavity is going to filter with different components of the conche and hair warming, and it's also going to add some moisture to it because that allows better gas exchange. The other thing is the sound production. This is going to happen in the larynx, which is part of the respiratory tract, and olfaction is going to be in the nasal cavity as well. So that olfaction is smelling. Looking, and we're going to repeat this quite a bit, of different types of respiration. So it all depends on where you are. So first, breathing is actually called pulmonary ventilation. So pulmonary meaning the lungs, and ventilation is movement of air. So this is literally the breathing part that we talk about, of moving air into, breathing in, and breathing out of the lungs. So breathing out, get rid of air, breathe in, bring in air. So the difference between pulmonary ventilation is actual movement of the air. And this is a mix of air. It's not just pure oxygen that's coming in and pure carbon dioxide that's going out. This is just getting air into your lungs. Once air is into your lungs and into your alveoli, which is going to be the kind of where the site of gas exchange occurs, then we're talking about external respiration. This is exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the blood and the lungs, specifically the alveoli. So external respiration is exchange with the external air that's coming in. So it's coming from the outside in, and the blood. So this is happening at the lungs. And it doesn't matter external. So we have oxygen coming into the blood and carbon dioxide leaving the blood and going to the lungs. Internal respiration, even though this is still inside because this is in your chest, but we consider it external because it's exchange with external air that came in. This is gases that are already in your blood. So they go from your blood and then go to do internal respiration. This is exchanged between the blood vessels and the tissues. So this is oxygen actually getting into the tissues to be used in that extracellular fluid, and carbon dioxide going back into the bloodstream to go back to the lungs. So internal respiration is between the systemic blood supply and the actual tissues that need these gases to be exchanged. Cellular respiration is the last one. We're not going to really focus on this much because we talked about cells in Anatomy and Physiology 1. But metabolic pathways that are going to use oxygen, mainly things that are making ATP in your mitochondria and produce carbon dioxide as a waste product. Then it goes into the extracellular fluid, and if it's carbon dioxide, to be exchanged with the bloodstream. So we're not going to talk so much about cellular respiration, but internal respiration, external respiration, pulmonary ventilation are going to be very important with this chapter. Looking at the upper respiratory tract, so this is going to be the nose, the nasal cavity, your sinuses around your nose, and your pharynx, which is going to be the back of your throat. So down kind of the beginning of your neck until you get to your larynx. So this is back of throat. And we'll look at it more specifically later. This again, the upper respiratory is going to warm air. So it's going to take air in kind of varying temperatures that are on the outside world and make it closer to body temperature. It's going to add some water. So it's going to humidify our lungs like some water in our air, not just dry. And then nasal hairs and conchi and things like that, mucus, all of those are going to help filter it because air is not clean. What you're breathing in has dust and dirt and hair and all sorts of other things. So we want to filter it out as much as possible before it goes deeper into our lower respiratory tract. Lower respiratory tract is sound production. Like I said, this is happening at the very level of the larynx, which is going to be the opening to your trachea. So larynx is opening kind of area that's made of cartilage to trachea. And the trachea is the pipe that leads down into the lungs. So we make sound and then gas exchange is occurring in the lower respiratory tract. So it goes larynx to the trachea branch off to bronchi, and then bronchioles is going to be the next one, down to the lungs. And in the lungs, we're going to have alveoli, which are going to be little kind of blinded sacs. So this is the site of gas exchange. That's where the magic happens, is in the alveoli. All the other parts, so this makes sound, the larynx, this is just pipe to get the air down to the alveoli. Same thing, pipe, get air down to the alveoli. So these are just transport until we get to where the respiration actually occurs. So site of gas exchange, and you can say the site of external respiration. So this is kind of what I was just talking about. We have the respiratory zone, which is where gas exchange actually occurs. And then we have the conducting zone, which is going to be just the pipes that transport the gas to the actual gas exchange areas. So this still, the conducting zone, all the pipes are going to continue to help clean, warm, and humidify the air as it's traveling down to the respiratory zone. The respiratory zone is the last zone they get deep into the lungs. Specifically, respiratory bronchioles are really teeny tiny, leading into alveolar ducts. And then alveoli again is where the magic actually happens. Alveoli, the epithelial cells are going to be thin, simple squamous. So you remember way back to A&P1, we learned about tissues. It's going to be those thin, flat, simple squamous cells that line the alveoli. Why? Well, we don't want a long distance to go. So say oxygen's coming down, it needs to go into the capillaries there, the pulmonary capillaries. Well, oxygen doesn't want a long way to travel. If it can just go quickly into the blood supply, that's a good thing. So we want just a short distance between the capillaries and the alveoli. And then same thing with carbon dioxide. We want it to easily go back. So we want a kind of thin layer where these travel easily between the capillaries and the alveoli. We also have some respiratory defense. Again, air is not clean, so we want to make sure that we're filtering as much. So nasal hairs, making sure we're protecting our alveoli from all the dirt and debris and nasty things that can be in the air. So we also have, if you remember again, way back, a lot of the respiratory tract is pseudostratified columnar, but the major thing is it's going to have the cilia. Remember, those are the hair-like projections that we have off the cells that can help move mucus. So what happens is mucus is going to be made. We have goblet cells. Wherever you see a goblet cell, there's going to be mucus. And this is the inside of the trachea. So you have mucus here. Something sticks to the mucus. You can think of that. And what we can do is we can move it and kind of move it up and out. We don't want it to go down. Say if this is the lungs area, we don't want to go down into the alveoli in the lungs. We want it to go out. So we can actually travel up and out and then even swallow the mucus. So then the acid of the stomach can take care of it. So anything that's dirty and nasty that we don't want in our lungs, we can get rid of by this mucus escalator. So just travel mucus up backwards and away from the lungs. The nose. So first part is the only visual part. So this is the only external part, meaning we can see it, of the respiratory system. So you can see it from the outside. This is just the opening. So this is how we inspire and expire. You can do it through your mouth, but we like to be nasal breathers because then it helps warm, humidify, clean, filter. So that's why, especially going through the nasal cavity in the nose is important. Also, this is where our olfactory receptors are. Again, smell is going to be part of the nasal cavity in the nose. And also, it's helpful for speech. We call it a resonating chamber. So as you're making the noises, it can resonate and bounce off your nose, nasal cavity. And that's why your voice can change when you have a cold or you're congested. Your nose can be kind of more, or your sound can be more nasally. That's because it affects this resonating chamber having congestion. Paranasal sinuses. So para means around and nasal meaning around the nose, and sinuses. So we have the frontal, and you remember that's going to be in the frontal bone. We have ethmoidal air cells, which are going to be part of the ethmoid. We have a maxillary sinus, and we have a sphenoidal sinus. So it's all associated with the bones that we've learned about in AP1. There's always mucus. Mucus is kind of a big thing with the respiratory system. So mucus is secreted by the sinuses. This helps clean because mucus is sticky. Snot is very much mucus. It's sticky. So anything, dirt, debris that's going by and has contact with the mucus will stick to it. And then it also helps moisten that air. So again, we humidify it, make sure that it's easier to exchange. The sinuses drain with tears through the nasal lacrimal duct, so that's going to be going through your nose. That's why kind of congestion in your nose can get congested in your sinuses because they all are all connected. The nasal septum is actually formed by the vomer and the ethmoid, just separating two nostrils. So can just kind of see this separation, nasal septum between sides. So you have a left and a right. The pharynx, remember, kind of talked about it's the back of the throat, and it does have different areas based on where it is. So this entire thing right here in the color portion is the pharynx. And so it's connecting the nasal cavity, the mouth, and then going down into the larynx or the esophagus. So kind of the two holes that you can lead to. So there's two pathways at the end of the pharynx. It is made up of skeletal muscles, so it is kind of voluntary, at least when swallowing, kind of voluntarily. And it's named based on what it is posterior to. So if it's posterior to the nasal cavity, it's nasopharynx, and that's this green color right here. So this is the nasopharynx. If you're posterior to the mouth, then this is the oropharynx. This is kind of the upper soft palate down kind of this region, the blue region here. So it's the soft palate too. Kind of didn't go all the way. This is the epiglottis here. So this is the passageway for both food and air because it's your mouth. So you swallow and it's going to go down into the esophagus. And your breathing air is going down into the trachea. The thing that determines which way it goes is called the epiglottis. That's going to be some elastic cartilage that closes, and it'll close the whole opening to the trachea. Well, if that's closed, then the only other way is to go down to the esophagus. If it's open, then air can go freely down. So when we're swallowing, then we're going to see that when we talk about the digestive system, the epiglottis kind of closes. So it kind of lifts up a little bit and closes against the epiglottis. So laryngopharynx, the epiglottis, and different cartilages that we're going to talk about are going to be in the purpley region, and that's going to be the laryngopharynx. It's posterior to the epiglottis when it's upright. Again, the larynx is cartilaginous too, meaning it's going to be different part of cartilage. We're going to learn about all these in lab. So the epiglottis more, the hyoid bone, all these ligaments, the trachea, thyroid cartilage, cricoid, arytenoid, all of those things we're going to learn about. So this is going to be cartilage, which is kind of a thicker, not as thick as bone, but protective kind of component to it. And it protects the glottis. And the glottis is going to be the opening to the trachea, but also where your vocal cords are. And your vocal cords are around it. So that's why we say voice box, because your vocal cords are what vibrating that make your noise when you're speaking. So we have three major cartilages. Again, the elastic cartilage called the epiglottis, the thyroid cartilage, and the cricoid. Again, we're going to go over that more significantly in lab. Trachea, there's 4 tissue layers. The trachea has cartilage too. So hyaline cartilage rings these tracheal cartilage, making sure it stays open. They're not complete cartilage. They kind of make C's, so they don't go all the way around the posterior side. Kind of have a little C-shaped, but they're supportive and help hold the trachea open. We have serosa, which is the outer layer. And then we have submucosa, and then we also have mucosa. So mucosa is that inner epithelial layer. And then again, this is pseudostratified epithelium with goblet cells. Goblet cells, no matter where they are, make mucus. And then they're ciliated. So again, that's helping prevent things to go down into the lungs because they're direct connection to the lungs. So we can have mucus transported back up and actually go into the esophagus. The trachea, what we says bifurcates, meaning it divides in two. So there's a Y or fork at the end of the trachea comes down, and you can either go to the right side or the left side because there's a left lung and then there's a right lung. And these major kind of leading off, so trachea ends and goes to right and left bronchi. And again, we'll go over more of that significantly in lab, but remember ciliated pseudostratified epithelium is going to be in the trachea. Bronchi are going to be even smaller. So we have our main bronchi that are going to branch into smaller and smaller. And we have kind of a bunch of branches that go, we call it the branchial tree because it keeps getting smaller and smaller. So we have our main bronchi, and then they're going to branch off, and then they're going to branch off. And then we keep getting smaller and smaller and smaller until we get to the alveoli. Just like I mentioned before, bronchi are going to be conduction zones, so they're just the piping leading to the respiratory zone. So respiratory zone is where gas exchange actually occurs. So part of the branching kind of learn is going to be right and left main bronchi to lobar bronchi and segmental bronchi. Again, we'll learn more about that in lab. Sometimes you can see it as primary, secondary, and tertiary as well of bronchi. So we get smaller and smaller until we get to bronchioles. And bronchioles are actually going to have smooth muscle involved with them. So there's less cartilage as we're getting smaller. There's still cartilage in the bronchi, but as we're getting in smaller and smaller, there's less cartilage and more smooth muscle. So smooth muscle, remember when we talked about blood vessels that we can open and close? Bronchioles can dilate and become larger, or they can constrict and become smaller. And that's because of the smooth muscle there. Depending on airflow, whether we want more airflow into our alveoli or less. So these can differ. And so a lot of smooth muscle in that. Eventually, we lead to terminal bronchioles, getting the smallest, to alveolar ducts, to alveoli. And again, we'll look at that more in lab. Just showing picture form of how we kind of go. So trachea, main bronchi, lobar bronchi, segmental bronchioles, terminal bronchioles to pulmonary kind of pieces or lobules. So again, this is kind of, I already talked about it, but talk about it again. Changes from bronchi to bronchioles changes. So again, bronchi does still have hyaline cartilage. So from the trachea, those cartilage rings continue into the bronchi just to make sure that they're keeping kind of enlarged and open. Once we're getting to the bronchioles, they become more elastic fibers, so they're more stretchy versus kind of being rigid and holding it open. So they become kind of irregular and then eventually elastic fibers. The epithelium changes. So pseudostratified columnar going from the trachea down into the bronchi. Once we're getting to the bronchioles, it actually changes to cuboidal. So we go from a tombal column and sometimes looks like a multiple column to then now we're cubes. Cilia don't happen anymore. Now you're getting down to more of the you're getting towards the respiratory conduction zone. Cilia get in the way of that, so we don't want it. And we don't want mucus in the way either, because it's going to be sticky and in the way of gas exchange, because we're getting smaller and smaller down to the bronchioles and getting down to the respiratory zone. So we want to change over to more getting to eventually the respiratory gas exchange versus kind of protection and mucus production. Again, the amount of smooth muscle increases. So bronchioles can provide what we call resistance to air passage. This is what I just talked about, where bronchioles can dilate, so there's less resistance. So increase in diameter, same thing that we saw in blood vessels. Increase in diameter of the bronchioles, you decrease resistance. So airflow is going to increase. It's easier for air to flow through. If you decrease the diameter of the bronchioles, then you're increasing resistance and you're decreasing airflow. So that's because of the smooth muscle that's in the bronchioles. You don't have that. You have cartilage that's going to hold it open. So this is going to be more control of air movement into the lungs. So again, bronchioles, no cartilage, thick, smooth muscle. Sympathetic nervous system is going to cause that bronchodilation. So think again, fight or flight. What are you going to need when you are running or fighting? Well, you need more oxygen. So what are you going to want to increase? Airflow. How are you going to do that? You're going to increase the diameter of those bronchioles. So you're going to get larger, less resistance, larger kind of tube. So think of the straw, big straw, you can get more in. So that's going to happen with the sympathetic. When you are resting and digesting, so you're in the parasympathetic, rest and digest. This is going to cause bronchoconstriction. So you decrease the diameter of the bronchioles. You don't need as much oxygen right now. You still need it. You still need airflow all times. If you don't, you're dead. But you don't need as much. You're not running, you're not fighting, you're not kind of providing oxygen more often. So you don't need as much. We conserve our energy. So you decrease airflow because you have increased resistance. And you don't need as much oxygen here. Again, respiratory zone, now we've gone from bronchioles to terminal bronchioles. So the terminal means the end. That's going to go into respiratory bronchioles. So we go terminal and then we go respiratory. Respiratory are going to go into alveolar ducts. So this is showing you a respiratory bronchiole into an alveolar duct into the alveolar sacs. And the alveolar sac is kind of like a cluster of grapes. So you can think of the respiratory bronchiole as kind of the stem of your cluster of grapes. Each grape is called an alveolus, or alveoli is plural, so that's how you see it. So cluster of alveoli, this is an alveolus, this is an alveolus, multiple are alveoli. 300 million alveoli is going to be the lungs, and this is the most of the lungs. And again, we have alveolar ducts and respiratory bronchioles are part of the respiratory zone because they're all leading to where the magic happens of the alveoli. So gas exchange is happening in these alveoli. Remember, thin, simple squamous epithelium. So we have a thin layer of epithelial, so gas can go quickly through. And again, we're going to look more at this specifically in lab, but understanding all of this will help you with the physiology. When we get to the alveoli, there are 3 cell types. So there's pneumocyte 1, type 1, and pneumocyte type 2. Pneumocyte type 1 are going to be the thin, simple squamous epithelium that we're talking about. So those cells. This is going to happen where gas is going to diffuse. So again, oxygen is going to go into, so external respiration from the alveoli into the capillaries. Carbon dioxide is going to leave the capillaries and go into the alveoli. And this is happening at pneumocyte type 1. Pneumocyte type 2 are kind of less, so most of them are going to be pneumocyte type 1. There's pneumocyte type 2s kind of sandwiched in between. So you see pneumocyte type 2 is here, and then most of the rest of these layers are going to be pneumocyte type 1, the simple squamous part. Pneumocyte type 2 produces a product, a secretion called surfactant. And it's oily secretion, so lipid. Remember what happens with oil and water. You mix, they repel it. So surfactant actually reduces what we call surface tension of water. So remember, surface tension is because of hydrogen bonds. Learn that in AP1. Hydrogen bonds that water loves to make. So we have our alveoli kind of look like this. And if we have water here, and we have water molecules over here, Well, their desire is to make those hydrogen bonds. And the hydrogen bonds makes a high surface tension. Remember, that's why bugs can walk on water, because they like to stick together, the water molecules. So there's a high surface tension. What we do for surfactant is actually prevent this from happening, so we don't have that happen. So what would happen, again, if you had a water molecule over here and a water molecule over here, and then they're making bonds? Well, these are thin, delicate alveoli. So what are they going to do? They're going to collapse. So what we do is we add oil that repels water because it doesn't mix. Oil and water do not mix, so that you keep the alveoli open and happy. So pneumocyte type 2 producing surfactant is really important. In fact, when newborns, if they're preemies and they're born too early, their lungs haven't fully developed, we actually give them surfactant because we worry about not having it and having surface tension in the water in your lungs and collapsing the alveoli. With collapsed alveoli, where does the oxygen go? It can't come in and it can't exchange. So we need those alveoli to be wide open and oxygen being able to come in easily. The last part of the alveoli, because I said there's 3 cells, so there's pneumocyte type 2, there's pneumocyte type 1, which is a simple squamous. The last one are our friends, the macrophages. So we've learned about macrophages before. They haven't changed. Same thing. They're alveolar macrophages. So what do macrophages do? Phagocytize. So they eat. So anything that's gotten past our defenses of the trachea, the mouth, the nose, all of those, all the way down, then we still have a backup plan of the alveolar macrophages. So anything that gets down there that could cause a problem and needs to be eaten will be consumed by these alveolar macrophages. So blood-air barrier is going to be where gas exchange, again, between the blood and alveolar air. So again, external respiration. There's 3 layers. So we have the alveolar cell layer, made up mainly going to be our pneumocytes, type 1. We have fused basement membrane. So the membrane of the alveoli is fused with the basement membrane of the capillary. And then we have the simple squamous epithelium of the capillary. Because remember, capillaries are just basically endothelial layer and a basement layer, not too much to it. So air has to go through the cell layer of the alveoli, through those fused membranes into the capillary, or vice versa. That's oxygen, vice versa if it's carbon dioxide. Looking at the lungs again, we're going to go into this more detail in lab. So we have the left lung and we have the right lung. Now the left lung has 2 lobes, superior and inferior. And the right lung has 3 lobes, right or superior, middle, and inferior. Why does the left have less lobes? Well, there's this, the cardiac notch. The heart is going to be, remember, more situated on the left. So remember, it's kind of the base and the apex comes down. So it's going into the left lung lobe space where a middle lung lobe would be. So we get rid of it and we have what we call a cardiac notch, is where the heart can kind of sit and be cradled by the left lung. What we have is separation between the lobes is fissures. So these kind of little lines separating the lung lobes are called fissures. If it's at a line where it's oblique, so it's going kind of at an angle, then it's called the oblique fissure. And that's all we have on the left is an oblique fissure, because this is the superior, the upper lobe, and we have the inferior on the bottom. On the right, we have 2 fissures because we're separating 3 lobes. We have oblique, which is still the same thing. It's at the angle. But we also have a horizontal that's separating the superior and middle lobe because it's at a horizontal line. So superior lobe, middle, inferior. And again, like I said, we'll talk more about this in lab. Each of our lungs is then divided into segments that are going to be kind of what we call bronchopulmonary segments because they're going to be supplied by different bronchus. So we have the lobar bronchus, segmental bronchus, all going down. So there's even more separation of the lungs, and you can actually see separation. So when we get to lobar bronchi, that's what's providing the supply of oxygen and taking away carbon dioxide from the bronchopulmonary segments. So there's more on the right, usually 8 to 10 on the left, depends. And they are separated by connective tissue. So when you look at the lungs, you can actually see it. You can see separation. Each of these segments has a bronchus, which is the lobar bronchus. And then there is or segmental bronchus. Sorry, we go lobar and then we go segmental, which is going to be provide each one of the bronchopulmonary segments. And we have a vein and we have an artery. And remember, veins is going to be the oxygenated part, and artery is going to be the deoxygenated part. Separate, it's different in the lungs. And then we have each one of segmental bronchus. We also have pleura. So remember, pleura is going to be the serosal membrane, those membranes that we talked about. So they are going to make fluid, serous fluid, that's going to divide the cavity into the thoracic cavity into compartments and then the middle. So you have two areas with lungs, so a right and the left for the lungs, and a middle compartment where it's the mediastinum. So we have kind of the middle, and then we have the kind of right and left. And just like other membranes, we talked about parietal and visceral pericardium when we talked about the heart. Same thing that's going to be in the pleura. You have the parietal pleural, which is going to be the outer layer. So this is going to be on the wall of your chest, the thorax, and also goes down to the diaphragm, the major muscle of respiration. The visceral layer is actually going to be on the lung surface. So it's going to be on the outer surface. So it's again a double membrane. The pleural cavity is this teeny tiny space that's between the two layers of the pleura. So the parietal pleura on the thoracic wall, and the visceral pleura on the lung surface. So the space between those is our pleural cavity. In that space, wherever we have moving parts, we're going to produce fluid. And so pleural fluid is again serum, basically. So it's serosal fluid. So it's clear fluid that is produced to make sure that we have lubrication. So we don't want friction every time the lungs are moving and expanding and contracting. We want that kind of smooth movement. So we can have lubrication. It's the same thing happens in the heart. There's going to be pericardial fluid that's in there that can help with movement and friction, prevent friction of movement of the heart. So we want to prevent friction and movement of the lungs. So just in summary, we go nasal cavity, pharynx, larynx, trachea. We have bronchi, which is either primary or main. You kind of hear it both ways. Secondary lobar or segmental. And tertiary bronchioles, terminal bronchioles, respiratory bronchioles, and then the alveoli.